Chapter 2, Puritan Power. Okay, so by now hopefully you're saying, wow, this really isn't like the history books I'm used to. And if you aren't saying that, well, you're a liar. And guess what? You wouldn't be the first. After Gomes Eanes de Zurara's ridiculous money-grabbing lie, there were other European race theorists who followed suit, using his text as a jumping-off point for their own concepts and racist ideas to justify the enslavement of Africans. Because if there's one thing we all know about humans, it's that most of us are followers, looking for something to be a part of to make us feel better about our own selfishness. Or is that just me? Just me? Got it. Anyway, the followers came sniffing around, drumming up their own cockamamie, best word ever, even better than Zurara, though possibly a synonym, theories, two of which would set the table for the conversation around racism for centuries to come. Those theories were: one, climate theory. This actually came from Aristotle. We'll get back to him later, who questioned whether Africans were born this way or if the heat of the continent made them inferior. Many agreed it was climate, and that if African people lived in cooler temperatures, they could, in fact, become white. And number two, curse theory. In 1577, after noticing that Inuit people in northeastern freezing cold Canada were darker than the people living in the hotter south, English travel writer George Best determined, conveniently for all parties interested in owning slaves, that it couldn't have been climate that made darker people inferior, and instead determined that Africans were, in fact, cursed. First of all, could you imagine someone on the Travel Channel telling you that you were cursed? Like, really? And what did Best use to prove this theory? Only one of the most irrefutable books of the time, the Bible. In Best's whimsical interpretation of the book of Genesis, Noah orders his white sons not to have sex with their wives on the ark, and then tells them that the first children born after the flood would inherit the earth. When the evil, tyrannical, and hypersexual Ham goes ham and has sex on the ark, God wills that Ham's descendants will be dark and disgusting, and the whole world will look at them as symbols of trouble. Simply put, Ham's kids would be black and bad, ultimately making black bad. Curse theory would become the anchor of what would justify American slavery. It would branch off into another ridiculous idea, the strange concept that because Africans were cursed and because, according to these Europeans, they needed enslavement in order to be saved and civilized, the relationship between slave and master was loving, that it was more like parent and child, or minister and member, mentor-mentee. They were painting a compassionate picture about what was certainly a terrible experience because, well, human beings were being forced into servitude, and there's no way to spin that into one big happy family. But the literature said otherwise. That's right, there was another piece of literature, this one written by a man named William Perkins, called Ordering a Family, published in 1590, in which he argued that the slave was just part of a loving family unit that was ordered a particular way, and that the souls and the potential of the souls were equal, but not the skin. It's like saying, I look at my dog like I look at my children, even though I've trained my dog to fetch my paper by beating it and yanking its leash. But the idea of it all let the new enslavers off the emotional hook and portrayed them as benevolent do-gooders cleaning up the Africans. A generation later, slavery touched down in the newly colonized America, and the people there to usher it in, and more important, to use it to build this new country, were two men, each of whom saw himself as a similar kind of do-gooder. Their names, John Cotton and Richard Mather. About Cotton and Mather, they were Puritans. About Puritans, they were English Protestants who believed the Reformation of the Church of England was basically watering down Christianity, and they sought to regulate it to keep it more disciplined and rigid. So these two men, at different times, traveled across the Atlantic in search of a new land, which would be Boston, where they could escape English persecution and preach their version, a purer version of Christianity. They landed in America after treacherous trips, especially Richard Mather, whose ship sailed into a storm in 1635 and almost collided with a massive rock in the ocean. Mather, of course, saw his survival of this journey to America as a miracle and became even more devoted to God. Both men were ministers. They built churches in Massachusetts, but more important, they built systems. The church wasn't just a place of worship. The church was a place of power and influence. And in this new land, John Cotton and Richard Mather had a whole lot of power and influence. And the first thing they did to spread the Puritan way was find other people who were like-minded. And with those like-minded folks, they created schools to enforce higher education skewed toward their way of thinking. What school, do you think, was the first to get the Puritan touch? This is a trick question because the answer is the very first university in America ever. Remember, this society is all brand new. And the very first university in America ever was Harvard University. But a tricky thing happens with the opening of Harvard. A thing that directly connects to Zurara and the curse and climate theories and everything we've talked about thus far. See, Cotton and Mather were students of Aristotle, and Aristotle, though held up as one of the greatest Greek philosophers of all time, famous for things we will not be discussing here because this is not a history book, believes something else he's not nearly as famous for, and that's his belief in human hierarchy. Aristotle believed that Greeks were superior to non-Greeks. John Cotton and Richard Mather took Aristotle's idea, because they too were followers, and flipped it into a new equation, substituting Puritan for Greek. And because of their miraculous journeys across the raging ocean, especially Richard Mather's, they believed they were a chosen people, special in the eyes of God. Puritan superiority. According to the Puritans, they were better than 1. Native Americans, 2. Anglican English people who weren't Puritans, 3. Everyone else who wasn't a Puritan, 4. Especially African people. And guess what they did during the development of Harvard? They made it so that Greek and Latin texts could not be disputed, which meant Aristotle, a man who believed in human hierarchy and used climate to justify which humans were better, could not be disputed, and instead had to be taken as truth. And just like that, the groundwork was laid not only for slavery to be justified, but for it to be justified for a long, long time, simply because it was woven into the religious and educational systems of America. All that was needed to complete this oppressive puzzle was slaves. America at this time was like one of those games where you have to build a world, a social network of farmers and planters. And if you weren't a farmer-planter, then you were a missionary. So you were either dirt folk or church folk, everyone working to grow on stolen land. Obviously, their native neighbors weren't happy about any of this because their world was being broken, while a new world was being built, planted one seed at a time. That seed? Tobacco. A man named John Poree, a defender of curse theory, the cousin of one of the early major landowners, was named America's first legislative leader. First thing he did was set the price of tobacco, seeing as it would be the country's cash crop. But if tobacco was really going to bring in some money, if it was really going to be the natural resource used to power the country, then they would need more human resource to grow it. See where this is going? In August 1619, a Spanish ship called the San Juan Bautista was hijacked by two pirate ships. The Bautista was carrying 350 Angolans because Latin American slaveholders had already figured out their own slave trading system and had enslaved 250,000 people. The pirates robbed the Bautista, taking 60 of the Angolans. They headed east, eventually coming upon the shores of Jamestown, Virginia. They sold 20 Angolans to that cousin of John Poree, the one with all the land, who happened also to be the governor of Virginia. His name was George Yardley. And those first 20 slaves for Yardley and Poree were right on time to work. But remember, America was full of planters and missionaries, and the new slaves would cause a bit of conflict between the two. For the planter, the slave was a big help and would be the 4-digit code to the American ATM. Here comes the cash. On the flip side, missionaries coming down the line of Puritanism and Zurara's propaganda felt slavery was a means to salvation. Planters wanted to grow profits, while missionaries wanted to grow God's kingdom. No one cared what the enslaved African wanted, which, to start, would have been not to be enslaved. They definitely didn't want the religion of their masters. And their masters resisted too. Enslavers weren't interested in hearing anything about converting their slaves. Saving their crops each year was more important to them than saving souls. It was harvest over humanity, and the excuses they gave to avoid baptizing slaves were Africans were too barbaric to be converted. Africans were savage at the soul. Africans couldn't be loved, even by God. Chapter 3, A Different Adam. As I mentioned before, after Zurara's nonsense documentation about slave trading and the savage nature of Africans, many other Europeans started to write their own testimonies and theories. But it didn't stop with just Aristotle or George Best, the travel writer. A century later, the tradition, one that would go on indefinitely, of writing about the African was alive and well and more creative than ever. And when I say creative, I mean trash. There was a piece in 1664 by the British minister Richard Baxter called A Christian Directory. Notes on Baxter. He believed slavery was helpful for African people. He even said there were voluntary slaves, as in Africans who wanted to be slaves so that they could be baptized. Voluntary slaves? Richard Baxter was clearly out of his mind. There was also work by the great English philosopher John Locke. Notes on Locke in regard to African people. He believed that the most unblemished, purest, perfect minds belonged to whites, which basically meant Africans had dirty brains. And by the Italian philosopher Lucilio Vanini, notes on Vanini. He believed Africans were born of a different Adam, A-D-A-M, and had a different creation story. Of course, this would mean they were a different species. It was kind of like saying, or to him proving, that Africans weren't actually human, like they were maybe animals or monsters or aliens, but not human, at least not like whites, and therefore didn't have to be treated as such. This theory, which is called Polygenesis, broke the race conversation wide open. It took Zurara's initial benevolent master mess and put it in bold, like Africans went from savages to savages, which revved up the necessity for Christian conversion and civilizing. Pause. I know we've been going on and on about the people working to justify slavery, but it's important, very important, to note that there were also people all along the way who stood up and fought against these ridiculously racist ideas with abolitionist ideas. In this particular case, the case of Vanini's theory of polygenesis, a group of Mennonites in Germantown, Pennsylvania, rose up. The Mennonites were a Christian denomination from the German and Dutch-speaking areas of Central Europe. During the 16th and early 17th centuries, Orthodox authorities were killing them for their religious beliefs. Mennonites didn't want to leave behind one place of oppression to build another in America, so they circulated an anti-slavery petition on April 18, 1688, denouncing oppression due to skin color by equating it with oppression due to religion. Both oppressions were wrong. This petition, the 1688 Germantown Petition Against Slavery, was the first piece of writing that was anti-racist. Word check. Among European settlers in colonial America. But whenever people rise up against bad things tend to get worse. You know the old saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get racist, or something like that. So all that anti-racist talk coming from the Mennonites was shut down because slaveholders didn't like their business talked about like it was wrong, because they needed their slaves, because their slaves made them money. It's really all quite simple. Now, there's an obvious backdrop we need to discuss, the subject of our first grade color in the lines cornucopia worksheets, the misinterpreted, misrepresented owners of this terrain, the Native Americans. All this is happening on their land, a land that we had taken from them forcefully, claimed and owned by Europeans running from their homelands, afraid for their lives. It's kind of like the kid who gets beat up every day at school, comes home crying to his mother, and she decides to take him to a new school. And guess what he does when he gets to the new school? He pretends like he wasn't just on the receiving end of a boot sole and instead becomes the most annoying, tough guy in the world. And the Native Americans were sick of the tough acting, arrogant new kid. So, fight. The Native Americans and new white American beef had been brewing for over a year, but let's be honest, it had to have been brewing much longer than that. And when I say brewing, I mean people were dying, bloodshed in the soil. The Puritans in New England had already lost homes and dozens of soldiers, but eventually a man named Metacomet, a Native American war leader, was killed, which basically ended the battle in 1676. Puritans cut up his body like savages, as if it were a hog's, and paraded his remains around Plymouth. But Metacomet's tribe weren't the only indigenous people, obviously, or the only ones being attacked. Down in Virginia, a 29-year-old frontier planter, Nathaniel Bacon. Wait, let's take a time out and acknowledge the irony in the fact that there was a planter whose last name was Bacon. Bacon! Maybe he should have been a butcher. Anyway, Bacon was upset, not about the racist issue, but instead about the class issue. Here he was, a white laborer who was also being taken advantage of by the white elite. So what did he do to disrupt the powers that be? So what he did to disrupt the powers that be was to shift his anger from the rich whites to the Susquehannocks, a tribe of natives. This may seem like a strange move, but it was a smart play because the governor at the time, William Berkeley, was doing anything he could not to fight with the natives because it would mess up his fur trade and thus mess up his money. So attacking the natives was a way of attacking the power structure, but through the back door. As we say now, hit them in their pockets where it really hurts. And to make matters worse, Bacon declared liberty for all servants and blacks because, as far as he was concerned, though they were different races, they were the same class and should be united against the true enemy, rich whites. But the governor knew if blacks and whites joined forces, he'd be done. Everything would be done. It would have been an apocalypse. So he had to devise a way to turn poor whites and poor blacks against each other, so that they'd be forever separated and unwilling to join hands and raise fists against the elite. And the way he did this was by creating, wait for it, white privileges. Time for a breath break. Everyone inhale, hold it, exhale, and breathe it out. Privilege. Still here? Good. Let's move on. So white privileges were created, and at this time they included 1. Only the white rebels were pardoned. Legislators prescribed 30 lashes for any slave who lifted a hand against any Christian. Christian now meant white. 2, all whites now wielded absolute power to abuse any African person. Those are the 2 most important ones. Poor whites wouldn't be punished, but they could surely do the punishing. Chapter 4, A Racist Wunderkind. Remember John Cotton and Richard Mather, the Puritans who got the American race ball rolling? Well, turns out they had a grandson. Well, not the 2 of them together, obviously, but Richard Mather's wife dies, John Cotton dies. Richard Mather marries John Cotton's widow, Sarah. Richard Mather's youngest son, Increase, marries Sarah's daughter, Maria, making her his wife and stepsister. Increase and Maria have a son, February 12th, 1663. They name him after both families. Cotton and Mather becomes Cotton Mather. By the time Cotton Mather heard about Bacon's rebellion, he was already in college, an 11-year-old Harvard student, the youngest of all time. He was obviously a nerd, and on top of all that, he was extremely religious. He knew he was special, or at least meant to be, which of course did nothing but fill his fellow classmates with spite. They wanted desperately to break him down, make him sin, because no one likes a show-off. Basically, Cotton Mather was obsessed with being perfect and blamed himself for everything wrong or different with him, believing even his stutter, with which he struggled, was due to something sinful he'd done. Because he was so insecure about his speech impediment, Cotton Mather took to writing, and eventually he would write more sermons than any other Puritan in history. By the time he graduated from Harvard, he'd overcome his stutter, which to him was, of course, a deliverance from God. Being delivered from his stutter was a good thing because he was destined for the pulpit. The grandson of two Puritan preachers had to grow up to be one. No other choice, and there was no better way to begin his career as a clergyman than for him to co-pastor his father's, also a preacher, church. But while he was avoiding his bullies at Harvard, trying to use his words, and doing anything he could to walk a righteous path in the eyes of God, there was a tension brewing between New England and Old England. In 1676, an English colonial administrator, Edward Randolph, had journeyed to New England to see the damage done by Metacomet, the indigenous war hero, and his warriors. Randolph reported this back to King Charles II and suggested they tighten the grip around New England because clearly the New World experiment wasn't going so well. So now Big Brother was threatening to step in and clean up Little Brother's mess, which meant Massachusetts would lose a local rule if it didn't defy the king. Of course, the other option was for the colonists to just fall in line, but that would mean giving up everything they'd worked to build. Defiance seemed like a stronger play, and in 1689, New Englanders did just that. The thing about revolution is that it almost always has to do with poor people angry about being manipulated by the rich. So Cotton Mather, though a recent graduate of Harvard and a God-fearing, sermonizing, well-read man, had a problem on his hands because he was rich. He'd come from an elite family, gotten an elite education, and lived an elite, though pious life, far from the planters and even farther from the slaves. So the Revolution of 1688, which was called the Glorious Revolution, was not so glorious for him, and fearing that the anger that caused the uprising would go from the British elites to the elites right at home, meaning him, he created a new villain as a distraction, an invisible demon. Cue the scary music. Mather wrote a book called Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions. That's right, Cotton Mather, the genius boy destined for intellectual and spiritual greatness, was obsessed with witches. And this obsession would set a fire he couldn't have seen coming, but welcomed as the will of God. Mather's book, outlining the symptoms of witchcraft, reflected his crusade against the enemies of white souls. His father was just as obsessed, but no one poured gasoline on the witchy fire like a minister in Salem, Massachusetts named Samuel Parris. In 1692, when Parris's 9-year-old daughter suffered convulsions and chokes, he believed she had been possessed or cursed by a witch. That was all it took. The witch hunt began. Over the next few months, as bewitching instances continued to happen, people continued to be accused of witchcraft, which luckily for folks like Cotton Mather turned attention away from the political and onto the religious. And in nearly every instance, the devil, who was preying upon innocent white Puritans, was described as black. Of course, one Puritan accuser described the devil as a little black bearded man, and another saw a black thing of a considerable bigness. A black thing jumped in one man's window. The body was like that of a monkey, the observer added, the feet like a cock's, but the face much like a man's. Since the devil represented criminality, and since criminals in New England were said to be the devil's minions, the Salem witch hunt made the black face the face of criminality. It was like racist algebra, solve for X, solve for white, solve for anything other than the truth. Once the witch hunt eventually died down, the Massachusetts authorities apologized to the accused, reversed the convictions of the trials, and provided reparations in the early 1700s. But Cotton Mather never stopped defending the Salem witch trials because he never stopped defending the religious, slaveholding, gender, class, and racial hierarchies reinforced by the trials. He saw himself as the defender of God's law and the crucifier of any non-Puritan, African, Native American, poor person, or woman who defied God's law by not submitting to it. And just as it went with the theorists who came before him, the racist children of Zurara, Cotton Mather's ideas and writings spread from Massachusetts throughout the land. This was just as two other things were happening. Boston was becoming the intellectual capital of the new America, and tobacco was taking off, booming, which meant more slaves were needed in order to manage it. As the population of enslaved people grew, which is what slaveholders needed in order to till the land and grow the tobacco for free, the fear of more revolt grew with it. Seems like a natural fear in response to such an unnatural system. So in order to keep their human property from rising up, slaveholders and politicians created a new unnatural system, a new set of racist codes. Number 1, no interracial relationships. 2, tax imported captives. 3, classify natives and blacks the same way you would horses and hogs in the tax code, meaning they were literally classified as livestock and not as human. 4, blacks can't hold office. 5, all property owned by a slave is sold, which of course contributes to black poverty. 6, and white indentured servants who were freed are awarded 50 acres of property, of course contributing to white prosperity. And while all this was going on, all this systematic knife turning, all this racist political play, all the violence and discrimination, Cotton Mather, all high and mighty, was still trying to convince people that the only thing necessary, the only mission of slavery, had to be to save the souls of the slaves, because through that salvation, the enslaved would in turn be whitened, purified. Enslavers became more open to these ideas over time, right up until the first Great Awakening, which swept through the colonies in the 1730s, spearheaded by a Connecticut man named Jonathan Edwards. Edwards, whose father had studied under Increase Mather, was a direct descendant of the Mather's Puritan thought. He spoke about human equality in soul and the capability of everyone for conversion. And as this racist Christian awakening continued to evolve, as people like Edwards carried on the torch of torture, Cotton Mather continued to age. In 1728, on his 65th birthday, he called his church's pastor into the room for prayer. The next day, Cotton Mather, one of New England's greatest God-fearing scholars, was dead. But you know how death is. Your body goes, but your ideas don't. Your impact lingers on, even when it's poisonous. Some bodies get put into the ground and daisies bloom. Others encourage the sprouting of weeds that work to strangle whatever's living and growing around them.